Hey, it's Bob Pulver. Welcome back to Elevate Your AIQ. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most pressing issues in education, which is the impact of AI on learning, policy, and the future workforce. And who better to explore this with than David Hatami? David has spent 25 years in higher education, from admissions to academic leadership, and now runs EduPolicy.ai, helping institutions navigate the shift from an analog culture to a digital one. He's a passionate advocate for thoughtful AI adoption, ensuring that technology enhances education rather than undermining it. We break down the parallels between AI and past tech revolutions like the internet and social media, the challenges educators face in implementing AI responsibly, and how we can prepare students for an AI-powered future. We also tackle some of the tough questions like, should AI be banned in classrooms or should students be taught to use it responsibly? We know the answer to that. How can schools create policies that make sense across different subjects and disciplines? What do parents and teachers and administrators need to do to play their role in shaping AI literacy? And how is AI changing the job market so that they're prepared for higher education and beyond? This is a must-listen episode for educators, parents, and anyone invested in the future of learning. Let's get into it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Elevate Your AIQ. I'm your host, Bob Pulver. With me today, I have the pleasure of speaking Mr. David Hatami. How are you doing today, David?
Doing fantastic, Bob. Thanks for having me here today.
Absolutely. Yeah, looking forward to getting into this discussion. You and I have spoken a few times about this subject or this intersection of subjects, education and AI. So I'm looking forward to diving in. To kick things off, why don't you just give my listeners an introduction about who you are and what you're working on, a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. My background is primarily in higher education, been in higher ed now for about 25 years, spent most of those as a dean or academic administrator and, in a variety of institutions. I've basically, kind of been there from the beginning of online education. I started in admissions about 25 years ago. I mean, it was forever ago, and worked my way up the ranks in higher education, going back to graduate school several times in the process. Always been a fan of the AI though. I've always kind of followed the technology just sort of as I guess you'd call it as a hobby. And as it started to get serious, I started to get more serious about it as well. Recently just, finished my doctorate in higher ed leadership and administration. And about a year ago, opened a consultancy, EduPolicy.ai, where we specialize in helping higher ed and K-12 actually build policy and kind of make that shift from the analog culture to a digital culture, if you will, through the use of policy, through ethics, through kind of, education and all of the other means that are available. Essentially, it's about helping education sort of align with the technology and the landscape. I guess if you just kind of put it in the abbreviated format.
Since you've been in the space for so long and you've been following the technology as well, I mean, were there similarities to what happened with, the internet and online, access? I imagine, COVID, when everyone had to work from home, not that they didn't have
Yeah.
laptops before that and internet before that, but obviously remote learning. There were all kinds of aspects of the intersection of technology and education.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, social media was kind of so there was the internet and then there was social media and then now there's AI. And when we first introduced social media, I think we all kind of are very aware of, some of the negative repercussions from social media, both in terms of how they've affected kids, teenagers, young adults, because I think the fallout's a little bit more extreme there. And, it was just sort of thrown at us, literally like a hot potato, here, catch it. It is what it is. And nobody really understood the unintended consequences of it. And, it's only over time did we really start to recognize, hey, cyberbullying is a real thing, and all of the other pieces of social media. And I really can very closely analogize, the introduction of AI in the same respect, where there is this brand new technology literally thrown at us and we catch it and we're like, oh, this is great. This is amazing. And we can only see, we tend to have this, look at it through a little, let's say, rose colored glasses, where we essentially kind of see all these amazing things that it can do, all the great potential, which I absolutely advocate for. But we also need to be very aware of the unintended consequences. And that's sort of kind of the part that I think is pretty prevalent. And I think that's why, about a year ago, there wasn't much talk about ethics. But, fast forward a year, all of a sudden there is this newfound, wind about talking about ethics and, policies that shape it. I mean, let's face it, everybody's in a hurry to implement. Like, the technology is amazing. Let's, we got to jump on the bandwagon before we get left behind. And then what happens is they slap something together, they throw it together, they get it out there, and all of a sudden they recognize, oh wait, hey, wait a minute. Now all of a sudden we open this can of worms that we're starting to have bigger issues that we never really thought about. So that's sort of why it's important to do that, in a methodical way, in an organized way. And one of my favorite expressions is go slow to go fast, right? Take a little bit of extra time, craft some ethical policies around it, craft some rules around it, offer some training around it, and gradually roll it out. But, again, technology waits for nobody, and education is the incubator of the tech industry, as we all know.
That's a great sort of summarization of like how, putting what's going on now with AI into context of other big sort of transformations that we've had to consider and incorporate and adopt at various levels, whether that's within an organization or in an academic setting, and not just higher ed. To your point, I think some of this we did go through, even not just the adoption itself, but what kind of policies are we setting in place around governance, around ethics, around fairness, and in the education space, are we making sure that we're actually advancing the process of learning, and not just certainly memorization, and not just giving people tools such that they now forget how to think for themselves and know how to problem solve and think critically about different situations, different subjects.
Which is why, again, apologies, I didn't mean to interrupt. Which is why we need to make sure that we are adjusting our assessments and curriculum as we go through this process. And I think you and I had this conversation, in some of our earlier chats, that the importance of recognizing that it's not the same game. I mean, higher education has been the same for decade upon decade upon decade. And now all of a sudden, it literally within the last 2 years has been literally tossed on its head. And there's still confusion out there. And I think it kind of is reflective of how, faculty and administrators are trying to grapple with it from a technology standpoint. I think it's pretty fair to say, at any given institution, at least on an average perspective, there's probably about a 50% split between embracers and detractors. And that's not to say that the detractors don't appreciate the technology, but I think there's sort of confusion and or lack of education or a question as to the integrity piece of it, which I know is prevalent from the perspective of a faculty member. So again, detractors are not necessarily naysayers, but they're just not thoroughly convinced that it has a place in higher ed.
Going back to just this concept of trust, right? Like with the internet, it was more about getting access to more information, perhaps more knowledge. Social media, it was like now everyone has a voice, and we've sort of democratized, influence and intelligence and lots of other things. But in some ways, because everyone had an opinion, you had to sort of decipher for yourself which ones maybe you want to trust, you know, and even searching for information in Google. I mean, I think it's the way an AI search tool provides a response, provides an output is quite different. I'm sure most people have already recognized this, if they've even looked at the AI generated, search result summary in Google. But if you use Perplexity or, Grok or other things to sort of find information, you see that the results are completely different. But the part that's scary is these AI tools are responding to your inquiry or your request, speaking quite authoritatively about the
Yeah.
subject. It's only now that we're starting to see some of these tools actually show some transparency in terms of how it's reasoning. I use that term a little bit loosely.
Was because of probably the lawsuits on the intellectual property, that started all of that because
Yeah.
that's what was happening.
Yeah. So I just think, again, thinking about this from not just from a teacher or parent, perspective, but from a student perspective, we know if people tell people not to use something, especially students, they're going to try it anyway, just because they're curious and rebellious and whatever. But it also means that they've got to be more discerning and take a critical eye to what the results are telling you and not just take it at face value. And the problem is for students versus maybe someone who's been working for a while, someone who's more mature, I'll say, their life experience may help them sort of question whether the response is accurate. And I just feel like students run the risk of, oh, they don't know anything different. It sounds right. It sounds like a better answer than my dad would give me, so I'm going to go with it, right? And so,
Right.
yeah. So curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, the thing is, and that's the difference, with subject matter expertise. You can, and I can say this from, the perspective of teaching, right? You look at something and you sort of know if it's just sort of like a lot of generic, general stuff, sort of rehashed, rephrased in multiple ways, which is kind of what the AI technologies tend to do. But as a subject matter expert, you can look at it and say, well, it's not diving down deep enough. It's not tackling the correct points. But the students don't know that. And as you said, it sounds good to the students, sort of what is it when you were talking about the temptation to use the technology. I had this image flash in my brain of the big shiny red button that you're not allowed to push.
Right.
Cue the graphic of the shiny red button. It's like,
Right.
don't push it. Yes, I'm going to push it just because I'm not supposed to.
Yeah.
But but I think the other issue is this, even from a workforce perspective, right? There's a sense of obligation, I think, in higher ed to teach them how to actually use the technology correct so that they are prepared from a workforce perspective. But then there's also this dichotomy where it's don't use it because we don't want you to cheat on use GPT to write your English papers, and it's not going to help you learn. So there's this dichotomy there that we're trying to figure out and trying to manage in a way that is responsible, in a way that is meaningful, in a way that promotes pedagogy and critical thought. So and I think it's frustrating for faculty members. It's frustrating for administrators who have kind of thrown their hands up and said, "Well, I'm just going to let the faculty deal with it. It's an academic freedom issue. So, you do what you want to do." But they're kind of, therein lies sort of a problem with that. And it has to do with the consistency and or continuity of an institution having sort of different rules in different classrooms. So put yourself in the shoes of a student. You know, Professor A says, we're using GPT. We're going to incorporate it into our assignments. It's a part of what we do. It's mandatory. You have to use it. And, you kind of are developing ideas and thoughts and workflows on that. And then all of a sudden you go to your next class, don't use it. If you use it, you're going to get a zero. You're going to get a warning. If you do it twice, you're going to fail. There's no excuse for using this technology in my classroom. So what you've done is set up, again, a dichotomy from the student perspective that is going to frustrate them, especially this generation of, students who are digital natives, who don't know a world without the internet, flat screen TVs, AI, Xbox. They don't know a world without it. You and I know a world without this stuff. We were really thrilled to have our Atari console, and we thought that was the best thing on the planet. Like, it was like, oh my God, this is amazing. So a digital native is going to have a very different perspective on the technology, and then being told not to use it is going to frustrate them. And then how do students really voice their opinion? They don't really put it in a survey or a survey instrument. They vote with their feet. they're like, you know what, maybe this isn't the school for me because they're not going to give me the sort of workforce training that I need or I want. So maybe I'll go someplace else. Maybe I'll take a break and go somewhere else. And, from an admissions perspective, higher ed and Cape, more so on the higher ed side, that we spend way too much time and money trying to get, butts in seats, as they say, to leave it to chance that we're going to lose a student because we don't have a uniform policy, right? So back to what I was saying.
Hey friends, Marnie Robbins here, host of Vibe Makers, a podcast now on the Work Defined Network. Look, we all know workplace culture doesn't come from a slide deck. Gross. It comes from people. So on Vibe Makers, I talk to the folks shaping the experience of work from the inside out. You know, the HR and people ops folk, founders, leaders, and misfits building culture through small bets, big beliefs, and a whole lot of trial and error. No fluff. Well, maybe a little fluff, but mainly just candid talk about what happens when you stop duct taping your culture together. Come check us out. Listen to Vibe Makers wherever you get your podcasts.
If the institution doesn't have a standard policy or framework that they're following, then the faculty have no guidance, and then it's all up to the faculty, which is going to in turn frustrate the student stakeholder. So there's sort of this downward trickling effect of, it's not going the way that we want it. We want it to be, and it's frustrating because faculty don't necessarily may not want to embrace technology. I'm just thinking out loud, okay, so how do I use AI in a literature course, right? I'm like intro to literature. Like, how do I, and the point is I want them to read it. How do I get them to just read the book and talk about it and think about it when they're trying to use, chat GPT to tell me, the motivations of the characters, and they're not thinking as deeply as I want them to. So there's this rift, and being able to come up with, curriculum and assessment methodologies that are going to effectively kind of integrate some of their desire to use the technology, but also that's going to teach them the critical thinking skills that come with being able to discuss, these works of literature, whatever they are, and it's not easy. It takes time. But above all, we have to have faculty engagement in this process because they really are the front line, whether it's K-12, whether it's higher ed. It really is about the faculty because the administrators are there, in a perfect sense to help the faculty, give them the tools they need and the structure they need to get the job done. But sometimes I think you get these wars between faculty and administrators, and everybody's trying to prove their point, which doesn't serve anyone.
I guess you've got teachers who aren't quite sure what to do or how to incorporate or whether they should incorporate, or maybe they're just old school and they just don't want it. Like they don't even want to deal and they just want to keep going down the traditional learning education path, sort of sticking their head in the sand a little bit. And then you've got the students who are already using it because you already told them not to do it. Therefore, they immediately pressed the red button and started using it. The what about the parents like us who they're not keeping up with things like we are, and they're just kind of oblivious. I mean, let's be honest. Some of these parents have no clue what these kids are learning or doing all day. So whether they're in their room playing games or chatting with an AI companion of some sort, or like they don't know what's going on until they maybe look at the report card afterwards. And so I guess I just wonder like how we move forward, because the other sort of macro factor, just not to get political, but we know that the future of the U.S. Department of Education, and sorry for my listeners who are not in the U.S., but the United States Department of Education at a federal level is in the process of essentially being dismantled, which is going to push, like other things, including AI regulation itself, is going to push the onus to the states. And so now, I mean, you talk about potential sort of disparity across education. There were already, obviously, we look at how students are effectively learning in different states and stuff already, the gap there could get wider depending on, the resources that are available and how progressive, state level, departments of education actually think about how to better prepare their students for, higher education if that's what they want to do and think they need to do. I think the situation is different for people that have kids in in university already or in high school like us. But I mean, if my children were middle school, fifth grade to eighth grade, that age 10 to 13 or so, I would be really really concerned about what their preparedness for work, because we're talking about them not entering the workforce for another decade, and it's impossible to predict what things are going to look like at that point.
Yeah, it is hard. Yeah, it's like both of my boys. I can't tell you how many times a week I hear this. Well, why do I need this? Chat GPT can answer it for me, and every time I have it kills me because it's like you still need to actually learn something. You still need to know something. You can't Google and GPT everything in your life. You actually have to have a nut-based knowledge. And, to a degree, it's, they just need to grow up a little bit, but it's also, you have to look at the sentiment and the attitudes and, it's potentially generational, with regards to, dismantling of DOE from the federal level. I mean, it's very federalist principle, though, I guess you'd call it, to push the onus onto the states. So I guess it really depends on your perspective. I'm struggling. I'm really waffling, in terms of, what this is going to do, what the impacts are going to be, what the fallouts are going to be. Because, I mean, I can, with sort of a circular reasoning and circular logic, I can kind of see the benefits of and drawbacks of both. But I'm still concerned at the speed of which, this all seems to be happening, even though we sort of knew the handwriting was on the wall with it. I think it should be, even if there's reform involved, it should be done a little bit slower. And it's not about, just, just taking a wrecking ball to it. I don't know if that's the right approach, but I definitely can see some value giving the states some of these controls. I think it's a little bit easier, but I also do see value in a federal oversight as well. So it's, again, one of those arguments that you can literally, with circular reasoning, just depending on your perspective, be for or against, either any capacity. So it's very interesting to say the least in terms of, the developments and the speed behind which it's all happening. I guess we're literally just going to have to take a wait and see on it because I don't know.
I guess I'm curious, from what you're hearing at the higher ed level. I mean, are there any requirements that are changing? Like I think about as you know, I spend a lot of time in like the talent and HR space, and we're already seeing like job descriptions add, for us it was, do you know how to use a computer? Do you know how to use the internet? Do you know how to use Microsoft Office and, similar productivity tools and things like that? And so now it's, are you comfortable using, generative AI tools? Not in a, and I say generative AI specifically because I don't want people to think this is a hard skill like data science and analytics and whatever. So I want to focus on tools that the average, consumer can interact with. So that's why I say generative AI specifically. But companies are starting to say, well, we know that we are moving in this sort of AI powered future, and everyone will have to sort of get comfortable with that. So if you're entering the workforce and you don't have those skills, so now you don't have experience or, some of the skills that we know you're going to need to be more effective and efficient, sort of augmenting your own skills and capabilities and thinking. So I guess I just wonder, I know it's still early days, but have you seen any, policies or any changes to how higher education institutions think about, the younger sort of generations, and whether that is even a thought yet in college applications, or are we still too early for that kind of thing?
I know there's been a whole lot of changes in the admissions front. I think that's probably really the forefront of changes that I've seen from an administrator perspective, using AI technologies in admissions. I can think of a couple of platforms off the top of my head that are essentially, using algorithms to help, admissions representatives actually, know who to call when. So instead of, just the traditional round robin, there's platforms that literally tell your admissions reps, like, okay, Matt is ready for a phone call based on, 200, algorithmic touch points, that he lines up as being somebody who's ready to enroll. So, you know, the private industry is sort of trying to adapt the technology. The ed tech sector is trying to adapt to higher education to give them what they want. But from the administrator perspective, it's, there's still a lot of confusion because, as I said, there's still this shift of power, not a shift of attitudes when they're trying to actually, adjust from an analog culture to a digital culture. And that sort of kind of predicates the work that I'm doing and trying to help institutions find their place in the digital space, in the AI space. Because the truth is, every institution is going to do this a little bit differently. It would be remiss of me to say, okay, here's a boilerplate template, you know, fill in the blank. There you go. Have a nice day. It doesn't work like that because some of the most important parts of this are still very qualitative as opposed to quantitative because we're still dealing with people using AI technologies, which means you need student buy-in, you need faculty buy-in, you need staff buy-in, and the administrators have to be like flexible. They have to be, okay, I can roll with this and help make things happen. So once you have buy-in, at that point, you can start to build a culture. Then you can start to, educate and train your students, your staff, your faculty to better understand the technology, to help them be more comfortable with it. There needs to be work with instructional designers to help actually like start changing the fundamental context of how we educate, right? And then, once you kind of start recognizing that these pieces of the wheel need to change, that's, when you also need to, simultaneously, you still need to start building a policy where you have a, kind of a universal set of rules. And that can be from an institutional level, as well as a departmental level. So each department really should ideally have, a smaller policy that they utilize for their core needs because academics is going to have a very different perspective than financial aid, than the registrar's office, than student services. I mean, all these, core departments are going to have, they're going to be able to use the technology, but, if you think about it, even from an IT perspective, they're going to have access to different pieces of information. And how are they using that information? How is that information protected? What can they do to benefit from the technology and so on. So it's really, there's a lot of pieces. And that's kind of why this is a longer term process, if you will. I would say at a minimum 2 academic years to really kind of fully integrate, to kind of really get that process started. But even after that point, it's still going to be iterative. You're still going to be constantly revising and updating and changing because the technologies are novel and they are literally changing overnight. If we look back in history, there was this long gap in time between the Stone Age and the Iron Age and the Bronze Age and the Gutenberg Press and all of these historical milestones that essentially changed our society on a fundamental level. Fast forward, 2000, 2000 plus years, all of a sudden it's changing by the minute. It's changing by the day, by the minute, by the second, by the nanosecond, where, one day it's all about NVIDIA and the next day it's about DeepSeek.
Yeah.
It's like literally one minute it's this technology, the next minute it's that technology. And it's going so fast that it's dizzying. Even
Yeah.
for people who are paying attention and focused on it, it's still dizzying. And, let alone people who aren't even paying attention to it or don't care or don't know.
Yeah. In some ways, I feel like ignorance is bliss, right? Like it's like you want to use it, but you see some of because I do pay a lot of attention to it, not just from, the vendors trying to, promote their wares, right? But academics who are doing, deep, simulations of scenarios. I mean, someone just released a paper yesterday around DeepSeek. Forget about the data breach. Forget the fact that it's from China and we just are trying to, kick out TikTok,
Right.
and now everyone's jumping on this other Chinese tool. I mean, they were even flocking from TikTok to another Chinese app made by the same company inside China. It's like, what are you doing? So it's it's not surprising that people are trying to be sort of pay attention but be fast followers, like not be early adopters, because they don't want to get just sort of bitten by this bug too early because of the risks. But this recent study around DeepSeek was like they put it in a simulation and it literally was already immediately trying to figure out how to circumvent the system instructions, the fundamental guiding principles of how it needs to operate and communicate with its users. It was already trying to break some of those rules, rewrite rules, bypass rules, and use like essentially manipulation. It was trying to manipulate other AI agents. And so the output to the average user, it's it's unbelievable that this could happen. I didn't think that would happen until we had achieved artificial, general intelligence (AGI), which is forecast. Some say we're close to it. Some say OpenAI has secretly already achieved it. That's why I'm concerned and leaving the company. And yeah, but and others say, oh, no, it's not going to happen for a very long time, and we're not there yet. Whatever. But these are very concerning examples that we're already seeing when you really put this stuff to the test. And so it would be like everyone jumping on, some new, medicine without it being thoroughly tested, which is a whole nother concern given the current Senate confirmations we're looking at. But yeah, I mean, it does not surprise me that people want to wait, and I don't blame them. It's good to pay attention, and it's good to start the process of as we're talking about the ethics and the core sort of literacy, and what do we want to achieve, right? We've got to understand what is in the best interest of these students, of the future workforce. How do they continue to learn the durable, human skills that are necessary to succeed in the future, whatever, career path you choose. And, I just think you and I have talked about this. And I just think we're on the right path in the sense that we're asking the right questions. We're saying this kind of education, this kind of literacy can start quite early. These these kids are learning how to use these tools before they're even old enough to have a smartphone. And that smartphone already has AI in it. Their laptop has AI in it, and you can't ignore it. So just like we teach kids, right from wrong from a very early age, as soon as they're able to understand and absorb what, all this intelligence, and I use that term loosely as well, but all this seemingly intelligent, software and assistance, et cetera, we've got to teach them how to take a critical eye to that. I mean, I feel like that's a whole nother, I mean, it should be, I feel like this should be a subject just like computer science is a subject. But also to your point, I think about the compartmentalized rules, not just across the sort of focus areas within like a higher education institution, which could apply to, K-12 as well, right? Administration versus operations versus whatever. But even from a student experience perspective, even across those subjects, here's how to properly use AI in learning language and English. Here's how to, and maybe history, etc. And here's how to properly use it in math and science and what have you, right? Because that's the only way you know that the AI is working in a sort of coaching and mentoring and tutoring capacity as opposed to just shortcutting the learning process.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think you really kind of hit it there. And which is crazy because there's so much opportunity. There is so much yet to be discovered, so much more ways to make our lives easier and better and more comfortable. And I'm all for these things. I am. But I think at the end of the day, I I think this is kind of part of why I do the work that I do, because I recognize that we need to take this sort of with a grain of salt. And we need to recognize that we need to take just a pause, just a beat, and really just think for a moment before we jump into the pool head first, before we drink the Kool-Aid, by the gallon. It's it's great. I love every bit of it. It's amazing technology, but let's make sure that we're doing it responsibly. Make sure that, that there are protocols in place. Make sure that there is a personal code of conduct, in other words, AI ethics, which I would argue are going to essentially become the new compliance of, the 21st century. Ethics is the new compliance. And if we take it seriously and we get this right, we are going to circumvent a lot of issues down the road. You know, do I have a crystal ball? Can I predict, exactly what's going to happen? No. But what I do know is that, if we use the example of social media, because it was en masse, it's on the same scale and scope, I would argue AI is probably even going to be more impactful than social media ever was. Maybe, it'll be a fraction of what AI is how it's going to impact our world. And if we get this right, if we train this generation of digital natives the correct way the first time, we will set ourselves up as humanity to be on a much better course for the future. If instead of not letting them do it right, letting them think that there's shortcuts to everything, because when the pendulum swings, it always swings too far before it comes back. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to avoid that pendulum swing of this going too far the wrong direction. Kind of if you really want to get philosophical about it, it's sort of the analogy I can give you. Let's train this generation right. And it starts in K-12. Higher ed, they're prepping for the workforce. They're, becoming young adults, becoming adults. So let's train them in K-12, to recognize that this technology exists, what the rules are, how to think about it. And as they go into higher ed, how to apply that to the workforce. And I think, recognizing that we have to be flexible. And this is kind of what I would say to faculty, recognizing that we need to be flexible with our methodologies and our curriculum to really make this happen. And I fully respect the fact that, and even from my own perspective as a faculty member, we kind of want to hang on to the old ways because we know they work. We know that there is a sense of efficacy to doing it in a traditional way. But where the fly in the soup is, we have to meet our student stakeholders where they are. And that requires that faculty, that administrators kind of recognize that they may not get exactly what they want out of this, and they might have to be a little flexible, because at the end of the day, we are here for the student stakeholders. We're not there, to just to have a place to go. Anybody who teaches recognizes it as a sacred responsibility, a sacred duty, Because the truth is, anyone who's teaching, any faculty member, they could get a job that would pay them a lot more money and that would be a lot more comfortable. But they have chosen academia as their profession for a reason. It's because it means something to us to teach the next generation, to give something back. And, when we want to give something back, we have to recognize meeting our student stakeholders where they are, because the technology paradigm has shifted so dramatically in the last 2 years. And this shift is just going to become more seismic as the years progress. So I'll get off my soapbox now, but
No, this is really important. The other angle of this is,
Have you ever wondered what really makes a generation tick? Who gets to pick the name? And why the slang keeps changing? Don't worry, I can help. My name's Dr. Megan Grace. On hashtag Gen Z, I share the voices and experiences of Generation Z, how they're different from other generations, what moves them, and why they do what they do. In each episode, we go beyond the buzzwords and the stereotypes to dive into real conversations and the insights that matter to making intergenerational collaboration a reality. You can catch hashtag Gen Z on the Work to Find podcast network and wherever you listen to podcasts.
kids are creative, curious, and these are some of those durable human traits that are going to take them far if we allow them to explore. And to me, it seems like a lot of the interesting things that happen in, at least where my daughter goes to high school, are like some of the interactive projects, the group assignments. We're working on this, we're doing these fun things together. We're already using the computer. We're making videos on our phones, and we're incorporating this. And she's taking film studies, and they're doing all kinds of things related, offshoots of that. So whether it's another elective that they could take, whether it's a club, just like some of the after school programs that the school actually administers, or it is like this after school program where kids could explore this. Some of these tools are amazing, and you can't tell me that these kids wouldn't love to learn more about it. And it's not just to play with it, it's to actually build stuff, right? Think about what they're building already in digital platforms with Roblox and Minecraft and like stuff like that. Like, what you can't so what would happen? So everyone's worried about like the risks and whatever. And of course, any sort of AI literacy should incorporate ethics and fairness and things of that nature. But and cybersecurity and data privacy or whatever. I mean, even kids should understand that. I mean, technically, that's why parents are reluctant to give them media access in the first place, right? It's about data privacy. It's about protecting their information, their likeness, prevent bullying and cyber attacks, whatever. But it just seems like if you show them how to use it properly and you show them what it's capable of, whether it's in school or from a creative process, audio, video, etc., think about all the great ideas that you would get of these students. And you could have your own sort of incubation program around some of those ideas. We do that sort of one off in these specialized sort of, whether it's sponsored through the school district and the community, or there's other companies that are philanthropic and helping those kinds of things. But this could really unleash quite a bit of homegrown sort of innovation if you were to allow kids to unleash their creativity, and not to discount the importance that I think higher education provides. But some of these kids may not even be sure that they want to go to college. They don't know yet what they want to study. They certainly don't want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars doing it because they don't know when they're going to see the ROI of that. I think our kids in high school are past the point of no return. Like, my daughter's definitely applying and going to go to college. But I just wonder, like, if I had children that were in elementary school or and even middle school, I would want them to explore more about what they can offer, and think about that, the world is their oyster, and you don't have to spend, whether it's your money, my money, whatever. You don't necessarily have College doesn't necessarily have the the draw and the value that it has in the past. And so I just think there's so much incredible opportunity. I'm definitely exploring that within my own community. So yeah, I think there's incredible opportunity there.
You're actually, on that note, I think actually there's an article recently about, how in previous our generation, that, college was sort of, quote unquote, the ticket, and it was, the key to a better life. And I think this generation kind of questions that, from, as you said, from the ROI perspective. But going back to what you were saying about, unleashing the creativity, when you were saying that, it reminded me of the work by Howard Gardner and his MI theory, his multiple intelligence theories. And it really made me think that, I think these technologies might really help those sorts of individuals who have those really true gifts, whether they're artistic, they're musical, they're writing, they're, kinesthetic. It doesn't matter. There is a way that this technology can actually leap us forward in ways that we would not have been able to do without it. And, again, it's sort of theoretical and kind of abstract in concept, but, it sort of lays a predicate or a framework for, the actual people, technologists who actually do the work on the technology side. I can't write a line of code to save my life, but it's almost to the point where I can put it in a GPT and, pump out a Python script in 5 minutes. I mean, it's kind of crazy. So what it's doing is allowing people who didn't necessarily have a particular skill set to all of a sudden have a pseudo skill set, or to build a skill set much quicker. And that, I think, is what's going to be interesting from an advancement perspective. And I think you're right. It does reflect in higher education, because there is this question: do I really need this? Does this really make sense? I could be an influencer, or I could, do a tech startup, and make all kinds of money. But again, we have to ask ourselves, what is the fundamental reason of education? Is it to have an educated populace? Is it to train for a workforce? Is it just to be an educated human being? Right. And I think that line kind of gets blurred with degrees, curricular tracks and income streams. And I think there's sort of this worrying of, why do we need to be educated? Why do we educate our children? Why do we mandate it? So, these are all very high level, kind of, I guess, called philosophical questions in a way. And I know your specialty is more on that workforce side, the HR side. So I think you kind of get it. It's sort of that monetization of education in a sense. And, to what degree does it, make sense to, to not change what we're doing so that the students can be better prepared for the future. And I think that's kind of part of our eternal quest, if you will, in what we're doing.
Yeah, I think part of it is, how personalized are we making education, right? Like, not everyone learns best sitting in a classroom for hours on end, right? So, but teachers in general don't take that into account. I mean, it's one thing if it's like, you go to a reasonably, big university, and they've got, lecture halls where there's hundreds of kids or more, in the same class or whatever. But like, so that's not great for a large percentage of the population. And so I just think people learn things and absorb things different ways. And oftentimes life experience is how you learn a lot. And I think what I see is a lot of companies removing degree requirements. So this gets into one of the aspects of DEI that people don't talk about, but diversity means not just the color, your ethnicity, and your gender. It's it's cognitive diversity, it's diversity of experience, and it's marginalized communities that often get overlooked. It's previously incarcerated, people who are trying to get a fresh start. It's people who have gone to down a vocational path to, maybe a 2-year associate's degree or something like that. It's all these different pathways to potential success. And I just think, at least if you can expose kids early, then they can decide for themselves, perhaps, at least have a more informed conversation with their parents and their guidance counselor and what have you about what their prospects are. You don't have to just be, an entrepreneur, the next, Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg, who maybe went to college for a little bit but didn't finish. I mean, there's plenty of very wealthy, people, if that's your goal, that did not go to college or complete college. And so maybe that's one way, but maybe it's just look at all the life experience I can get and I can start making money. So instead of going into debt, I can actually start making money, even if it's just like a side hustle, or maybe it's just, I don't know. I mean, my career has been more, I like to say, more lattice than ladder. And I've just, I've always pivoted to things that were interesting to me. I mean, I don't have an HR background. I'm not an educator, but I'm correlating, like you said, like workforce issues, you know, employee, experience, learning and development, career progression, but also looking across industries for, different use cases or transferable skills or use cases for technology that could be applied. You know, oh, this, was born out of, supply chain, but now it could be used in, retail or education or whatever. So that's what I do. I connect dots and I connect ideas and I try to cross pollinate those things with people who can actually take them and run with them. And so I was not a good student. My daughter's a much better student than I ever was. I was a pretty good test taker, but what the heck does that tell you at the end of the day? So, but yeah, not everyone who's a good student is, you know, going to be, I mean, you can be a not good student and still have a lot of success in life. I certainly don't want any students to get discouraged just because they don't get, straight A's in high school. You're going to look back and, 10 years, 20 years and be like, whatever, like, that's not how I learned. That's not there was nothing there that got me excited. I had to go out on and experience life and figure shit out.
Figure it out as I go. Yeah. It's so funny. If anybody were to ask me what is my superpower, that's exactly what I would tell them. I have an uncanny ability to figure it out as I go. I sometimes, I can, I have these ideas and sometimes you just need to find an alternate route because life rarely works in a straight path. That's the one thing I figured out, after all these years. So
Yeah.
find a way to make it work one
Yeah.
way or the other. Yeah, exactly. This has been super fun, Bob. It really has.
Yeah, it's been great, David. Yeah, always enjoys our conversations, and we have a lot more to discuss once we stop recording too. So
Yeah, we should
yes,
plan
we-
a sequel. Plan a sequel
absolutely.
up to keep this conversation going.
Yeah, David, thank you so much for spending time with me and coming in the studio this time. So it's been great. I'll make sure to put link to some of your resources in the show notes for the episode.
That'd be amazing. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. No, it's a real pleasure to be here, Bob. Thank you for the invitation. Happy to come back anytime. I could go on and on and on, about this topic and all of the ancillary topics that it sort of kind of crosses over to because there's just so much out there. And I think trying to really get a grasp on it is not something that happens in one sitting. It's just about repeated exposure to understanding the technology, understanding, how it correlates with education. And, because there's so many moving parts that, again, this is just going to be an iterative process for everybody, not just you, not just me, but for administrators, for students, for faculty, for staff. We're all kind of learning as we go. And I think, together, as long as we're going, through this with a, responsible mindset, in terms of a framework, I think we'll be all right. And I think we'll figure it out as we go.
Sounds like a plan. I am cautiously optimistic. All right. Thank you, David. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next time.